The evening sun cast long shadows across Gideon "Gid" Parker's fields as he ran his weathered hands through the rich soil he'd tended for over 3 decades. The earth was good here, fertile and dark, holding promise like a mother holds her child. But tonight, something felt different. The air held an unfamiliar tension, like the calm before a storm. Gid was just securing his tools in the barn when he heard them, the thundering hooves of approaching horses, too many to be friendly visitors. The Reckless Renegades emerged from the tree line, their leather vests adorned with crude skull patches, faces twisted in malicious grins. Leading them was a man whose very presence seemed to darken the fading daylight. "Evening, old man," the leader sneered, dismounting with practiced ease. "Heard you've been refusing to pay protection fees to the right people." His boots kicked up dust as he approached, spurs jingling with each step. Gid stood his ground, his spine straight despite his years. "This is my land, worked by my hands. I don't owe you anything." The leader's laugh was cold as winter frost. "Boys, show Mr. Parker here what happens to folks who don't understand business." What happened next would haunt Gid's dreams for months to come. The gang descended upon his barn like locusts, their whoops and hollers punctuated by the sickening crack of splintering wood. They didn't just destroy his tools, they took pleasure in it. Axes were snapped, saw blades bent beyond repair, and his prized plow, passed down from his father, was dragged behind a horse until it was nothing but twisted metal. But it was when they set fire to his barn that something inside Gid broke and mended all at once. As flames licked the night sky, painting everything in hellish orange, the gang's leader approached Gid one last time. "Next time, we won't be so gentle." They rode off, leaving Gid standing in the midst of destruction, his life's work burning before his eyes. But in the reflection of those flames, something flickered in Gid's eyes. Not just grief, but a steel-hard resolve. Because what those renegades didn't know, what they couldn't have guessed, was that Gid Parker had a secret that would soon return home, bringing with it the kind of justice that only comes from the barrel of a legendary rifle. If this story of standing up for what's right touched your heart, drop a comment below telling us about a time when you or someone you know showed courage in the face of injustice. We'd love to hear where you're watching from and how your community comes together in tough times. Make sure to subscribe because this story of family, courage, and redemption is just getting started. The morning after the attack, Millbrook's dusty main street buzzed with whispered conversations. News of the Reckless Renegades' latest atrocity traveled fast in a small town, carried on hushed voices and worried glances. Gid Parker walked slowly past the general store, the saloon, and the sheriff's office, feeling the weight of sympathetic stares on his back. Inside Johnson's blacksmith shop, the rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil came to a sudden halt as Gid entered. Tom Johnson, his face streaked with soot, set down his tools and wiped his hands on his leather apron. "Heard about what happened, Gid," he said softly. "Damn shame." Gid placed a handful of coins on the workbench. "Need whatever tools I'll buy, Tom. Gotta get back to working the land, gang or no gang." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the exhaustion of a man who'd spent the night watching his livelihood burn. Tom picked up the coins, weighing them in his palm before pushing them back across the bench. "Keep your money, Gid. Times like these, we gotta stick together." He moved to gather some basic tools, but his generosity couldn't mask the fear in his movements. Everyone knew helping someone who'd crossed the Renegades was dangerous. As Tom wrapped the tools in burlap, the saloon keeper, Mac Wilson, stepped into the shop. His usual jovial demeanor was subdued. "Gid," he nodded in greeting. "Buy you a drink? Looks like you could use one." Minutes later, in the cool darkness of the empty saloon, Mac poured 3 glasses of whiskey. "You know," he said, his voice low and thoughtful, "this reminds me of something that happened a few years back, down in Mesa County. Gangs much like the Renegades were terrorizing folks there too." Tom took a slow sip. "What happened to them?" Mac's eyes took on a distant look. "Story goes there was this shooter. They called him the Phantom Shot on account of how he could take down a man's gun without leaving a mark on him. Never saw where the shots came from, never knew when he'd strike. But one by one, that gang started disappearing. Gid's hand tightened around his glass. The name seemed to strike something deep within him, a chord of memory he'd rather leave unplayed. "Whatever happened to him?" Tom asked, leaning forward. Mac shrugged. "Some say he hung up his gun, trying to find peace. Others say he's still out there, waiting for the right cause to bring him back." He looked directly at Gid. "Funny thing is, I heard he had some connection to these parts. Family, maybe." Gid stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Appreciate the drink, Mac," he said, his voice rough. "And the tools, Tom, but I best be getting back to what's left of my farm." As he stepped out into the harsh sunlight, Mac's words followed him. "Sometimes, Gid, the help we need most is the kind we're most afraid to ask for." Walking back to his wagon, Gid's mind wandered to a letter he'd sworn he'd never write, to a son he'd sworn he'd never call on again. But desperate times had a way of changing a man's mind about such things. Years melted away like spring snow as Gid sat at his kitchen table, pen hovering over paper. The single oil lamp cast dancing shadows across the walls, making the empty house feel even more hollow. Outside, crickets chirped their lonely symphony, a reminder of how quiet life had become since his son left. "Dear Jed," he wrote, then stopped. How do you begin a letter to a son you haven't spoken to in 7 years? A son who walked away from the farm, from his heritage, to become something his father couldn't understand, or wouldn't. Memories flooded back, sharp as broken glass. Jed had been different from the start, blessed or cursed, with a gift that set him apart. While other boys his age were learning to plow straight furrows, Jed could shoot a coin out of the air at 50 paces. By 15, he could outshoot any man in the county. By 18, his reputation had spread far beyond their small corner of the territory. Gid's hand trembled as he continued writing. "I know we parted on bitter terms. Your mother, God rest her soul, always said our stubbornness would be the death of this family. Maybe she was right." The lamp flickered, and Gid's mind drifted to that last argument. Jed standing in this very kitchen, gun belt slung low on his hips, eyes hard with determination. "I can't ignore what I'm good at, Pa," he'd said. "These skills, they're a gift. I can use them to help people." "Helping people?" Gid had scoffed. "You mean hunting men, becoming a gun for hire? That's not what Parkers do. We work the land, boy. We grow things. We don't destroy them." But Jed had seen it differently. He'd used his skills to track down murderers, to protect the innocent. They called him the Phantom Shot because he never killed unless he had to, preferring to disarm his targets with impossible shots that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The fame grew, and with it came the danger. Until one day Jed decided to disappear, trying to leave that life behind. But not before that final, terrible argument that drove father and son apart. Gid dipped his pen again, the words coming easier now. "The Reckless Renegades burned our barn last night, destroyed everything I need to work the land. But that's not why I'm writing. They're terrorizing the whole town, son. Good people are suffering, and I remember what you once said about helping those who can't help themselves." He paused, pride warring with necessity. "I was wrong, Jed. Wrong to try to force you to be something you're not. Wrong to let my fear for your safety turn to anger. This farm, this land, it's still your home. And right now, it needs the man you became, not the farmer I wanted you to be." Signing the letter with a shaking hand, Gid sealed it in an envelope. Tomorrow he'd ride into town and send it by express courier to the last place he'd heard rumors of his son's whereabouts. Whether Jed would come was another matter entirely. 5 days after sending the letter, Gid was mending a broken fence when he heard it. The distant sound of hoofbeats, steady and purposeful. He straightened slowly, shielding his eyes against the setting sun. A lone rider approached, silhouetted against the golden sky, his long duster coat billowing in the wind. Even at a distance, Gid knew it was Jed. No other man sat a horse quite that way, as if rider and mount were one being. As the figure drew closer, details emerged. The custom-made rifle slung across his back, the well-worn leather of his gun belt, the shadow of a beard on a face that had grown leaner, harder since Gid last saw it. Jed reined his horse to a stop 20 paces away. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The years between them stretched like an unbridgeable canyon. Finally, Jed swung down from his saddle, boots raising small clouds of dust as they hit the ground. "Pa," he said simply, his voice deeper than Gid remembered. "Son." Gid's throat felt tight. "Wasn't sure you'd come." Jed's eyes, so like his mother's, scanned the devastation around them. The charred remains of the barn still stood like a blackened skeleton against the sky. Broken tools lay scattered across the yard, testament to the renegade's cruelty. "Quite a mess," Jed observed, his tone neutral but his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "Been worse," Gid replied, though they both knew it wasn't true. An awkward silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken words and old regrets. Jed moved toward the burned barn, his steps measured and deliberate. He knelt, running his fingers through the ashes. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet but carried an edge sharper than any blade. "Tell me about these renegades." Gid watched as his son stood, methodically removing his duster. Beneath it, 2 revolvers rode low on his hips, companions to the rifle on his back. This was the side of Jed that Gid had never wanted to see. The gunfighter, the legend, the phantom shot. "About 20 of them," Gid said, "led by a man called Crow Mulligan. They've been terrorizing the whole county, demanding protection money, burning out those who refuse." Jed nodded slowly, reaching for his rifle. With practiced movements, he began checking the weapon, his hands moving with the same sure grace that had made him famous. "And the law?" "Sheriff's afraid. Can't blame him. He's got 2 deputies against 20 killers." The rifle's action clicked shut with a sound like fate sealing itself. "That's about to change," Jed said. And for the first time, Gid saw a flicker of the boy he'd raised in the man his son had become. Their eyes met, and in that moment, both men knew there would be time later for mending what was broken between them. Right now, there was work to be done. In the dimly lit confines of the Silver Dollar Saloon, Cyrus Crow Mulligan held court like a king among thieves. The reckless renegades sprawled across tables and chairs, their laughter harsh and their spirits high from their recent successes. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the stench of spilled whiskey. "You should have seen the old man's face," Crow declared, leaning back in his chair until it creaked under his weight. Standing there watching his precious barn burn. "Bet he wishes now he'd paid up when we asked nicely." His cruel laugh was echoed by his followers, the sound bouncing off the saloon's wooden walls. In a shadowy corner, a figure sat alone, his face hidden beneath the brim of a black hat. His presence went largely unnoticed, just another drifter seeking shelter from the approaching night. But beneath that hat, Jed Parker's eyes missed nothing. "Boss," one of the younger gang members spoke up, a wiry man with a rattlesnake tattooed on his neck. "Word is the old man's got a son, some kind of gunfighter." Crow's amusement vanished like morning mist. "That's so." He leaned forward, spurs jingling with the movement. "And where'd you hear this interesting piece of news?" "Overheard some old-timers talking. They say he's known as the Phantom Shot. Say he can put a bullet through a wedding ring at 100 paces." A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the soft clink of glass on wood as Crow set down his whiskey. "The Phantom Shot," he mused, rolling the name around like a bitter taste. "Heard of him? They say he disappeared a few years back. Some think he's dead." "What if he ain't?" another gang member asked nervously. "What if he comes looking for revenge?" Crow's hand slammed down on the table, making bottles jump and glasses rattle. Then he'll learn what happens to legends when they meet reality. We're 20 strong. One man, no matter how fast, can't stand against those odds." In his corner, Jed's finger traced the rim of his untouched whiskey glass. 20 men. Good odds, he thought. He'd faced worse. "Besides," Crow continued, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who'd never met his match, "old Gid Parker's probably too proud to call for help. Man like that would rather lose everything than admit he needs his son." The gang's laughter resumed, but there was an edge to it now, a hint of unease. Stories of the phantom shot had spread far and wide, and even hardened outlaws felt a chill at the mention of his name. As the night wore on, gang members began to drift away in twos and threes, heading to their various hideouts around town. None of them noticed when the stranger in the corner stood and walked out into the darkness, his spurs making no sound on the wooden floor. Outside, Jed mounted his horse, his face set in grim determination. Crow Mulligan had made two crucial mistakes: underestimating a father's love and believing that legends were just stories. He was about to learn how wrong he was about both. Dawn had barely touched the horizon when 3 renegades rode onto the Wilson farm, their intentions as dark as the fading night. Sarah Wilson, a widow struggling to keep her small farm alive, watched from her window as they approached her barn, torches in hand. "Time to teach another stubborn farmer about cooperation," one of them sneered, raising his torch. But before the flame could touch wood, a sound split the air, sharp as thunder, precise as fate. The torch exploded in his hand, scattered embers falling harmlessly to the dirt. The gang members froze, their eyes wide with sudden fear. Another shot rang out, and a second torch disappeared in a shower of sparks. The third man dropped his torch voluntarily, reaching for his gun instead. But before his fingers could touch the grip, a third shot sent his weapon spinning away into the darkness. From the shadows emerged Jed Parker, his rifle still smoking. He moved like a ghost, each step calculated and silent. The morning mist swirled around his boots, adding to his phantom-like appearance. "That was just practice," he said, his voice carrying across the yard with deadly calm. "Next time, I won't aim for the torches." His eyes, cold as mountain streams, fixed on each man in turn. "Tell Crow Mulligan what you saw here. Tell him the phantom shot sends his regards." The youngest renegade, barely more than a boy, stammered, But you're supposed to be dead." A ghost of a smile touched Jed's lips. "Do I look dead to you, boy?" He raised his rifle slightly, its barrel catching the first rays of sunlight. "Now ride, and remember, the next bullet won't miss." They scrambled for their horses, all pretense of toughness forgotten. As they galloped away, Sarah Wilson emerged from her house, clutching a shotgun. She stared at Jed with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "I've heard stories about you," she said softly. "Never thought I'd see the phantom shot with my own eyes." Jed checked his rifle, his movements precise and practiced. "Stories don't mean much, Mrs. Wilson. Actions do. And right now, this town needs action more than legends." He turned to leave, but Sarah's voice stopped him. "Your father. He was too proud to ask for help, wasn't he? That's why it took you so long to come back." Jed's shoulders stiffened slightly. "Pride runs deep in Parker blood," he admitted. "Sometimes too deep." He mounted his horse with fluid grace. "But some things run deeper still." As he rode away, Sarah Wilson watched until he disappeared into the morning mist. Later that day, when word spread about what had happened at her farm, people began to whisper that maybe, just maybe, the town's luck was about to change. In the Silver Dollar Saloon, when Crow Mulligan heard the news, his face darkened like storm clouds gathering. The phantom shot hadn't just announced his presence. He'd thrown down a gauntlet. And Crow Mulligan had never been one to back down from a challenge. The sheriff's office smelled of old coffee and tired hopes when Jed pushed through its wooden doors. Sheriff Daniel Hayes looked up from his desk, his face aging 10 years when he recognized his visitor. Behind him, young Deputy Will Cooper straightened from his slouched position. eyes wide with recognition. "So it's true," Hayes said wearily. "The phantom shot has come home." He stood slowly, his badge catching the afternoon light. "What do you want, Jed?" "Your help," Jed replied simply, laying his rifle across an empty chair. 20 men against 3 isn't good odds, even for me." Hayes shook his head, guilt and fear warring in his expression. "You don't understand, Jed. The Renegades, they've got connections, higher up. If I start moving against them, I'll lose more than just my badge." "And what about what these people are losing?" Jed's voice carried an edge sharp enough to cut. "Their homes, their livelihoods, their dignity?" Before Hayes could respond, the office door burst open. Gid Parker strode in, followed by Sarah Wilson and Tom Johnson. The blacksmith's apron was still dusted with coal, evidence of a workday interrupted. "Sheriff," Gid's voice filled the small office. "My son's right. We've been hiding too long, letting fear rule us. These are our homes, our families. If we don't stand now, when will we?" Hayes sank back into his chair, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. "I've got 2 deputies, Gideon. 2, against 20 killers." 3, Deputy Cooper stepped forward, his young face set with determination. "And I can shoot." 4, Sarah Wilson added, her widow's black dress a stark contrast to her fierce expression. "I may be a woman, but I can fight as well as any man." 5, Tom Johnson's deep voice joined in. "My sledgehammer might not be as precise as Jed's rifle, but it'll do the job." One by one, more townspeople filtered into the office, each adding their voice to the chorus of resistance. Jed watched silently, something stirring in his chest he hadn't felt in years, pride in his hometown, in these people who were finally finding their courage. Hayes looked around at the gathered faces, then back to Jed. "Even with these volunteers, we're still outnumbered." "Numbers aren't everything, Sheriff," Jed replied, picking up his rifle. "Sometimes it's about making a stand, showing them we won't be terrorized anymore." The sheriff stood again, this time with renewed purpose. "All right," he said finally. "But we do this smartly. We do this right." As plans began to form, Jed caught his father's eye across the room. For a moment, they shared a look of understanding. This wasn't just about protecting a farm anymore. It was about saving a town, about people coming together to fight for what was right. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, a fitting backdrop for the battle that was to come. The Reckless Renegades had no idea that their reign of terror was about to meet not just one legendary rifleman, but an entire town ready to fight back. The midnight air hung thick with tension as Jed Parker crouched in the shadows of what remained of his father's barn. The moon played hide-and-seek with the clouds, casting shifting shadows across the farmyard. He had positioned the townspeople strategically, Deputy Cooper on the roof of the house, Sarah Wilson in the cellar with a clear view of the southern approach, Tom Johnson and others hidden behind hay bales and farm equipment. The first sign of trouble came with the distant thunder of hooves. Not the full gang, this was a smaller group, perhaps 8 or 10 riders. Jed's finger rested lightly on his rifle's trigger, his breathing slow and controlled. "They're coming," Gid whispered from nearby, his old shotgun ready. "South Road, just like you said." The renegades emerged from the darkness like demons from a nightmare, their horses' breath steaming in the cool night air. They moved with practiced precision, spreading out to surround the farmhouse. Crow wasn't among them. This was a probing attack, testing the defenses. The first shot came from the renegades, a warning bullet that splintered wood near Gideon's head. Jed's response was immediate and deadly. His rifle cracked once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. 3 renegades tumbled from their saddles, their guns flying from their hands. "The Phantom's here!" one of them shouted, panic evident in his voice. But their leader, a scarred man they called Snake Eye, held his ground. "Burn it!" Snake Eye commanded. "Burn it all!" Flaming arrows arced through the night sky, finding purchase in the dry wood of the remaining barn structure. The fire spread quickly, illuminating the battlefield in hellish orange light. In the chaos that followed, bullets flew from both sides. Deputy Cooper's steady aim dropped another renegade. Sarah Wilson's shot from the cellar caught one trying to flank the house. Tom Johnson emerged from hiding to engage in a brutal hand-to-hand fight with a gang member who'd gotten too close. But in the confusion, Snake Eye had worked his way behind Jed's position. The shot caught Jed in the shoulder, spinning him around. His rifle clattered to the ground as he rolled behind cover, drawing one of his revolvers with his good hand. "Got you now, Phantom!" Snake Eye crowed, advancing with his gun raised. But he'd forgotten about Gid. The old farmer's shotgun roared, catching Snake Eye full in the chest, throwing him backward into the burning barn. The remaining renegades, seeing their leader fall, turned and fled into the night. "Jed!" Gid rushed to his son's side. Blood seeped through Jed's shirt, but his eyes were clear. "I'm all right, Pa," he grimaced. "Just winged me. But they'll be back, with Crow this time, and they'll be mad." As Sarah Wilson ran to fetch medical supplies and the others gathered to assess the damage, father and son shared a look of grim determination. The first battle had been won, but at a cost. The war with the renegades was far from over, and next time they would face the full fury of Crow Mulligan's vengeance. Dawn filtered through the farmhouse windows as Sarah Wilson finished stitching Jed's wound. The legendary gunman sat shirtless in his father's kitchen, his face betraying no pain despite the severity of the injury. Around them, the other defenders moved quietly, tending to minor wounds and reviewing the night's events. "You're lucky," Sarah said, tying off the last stitch. "An inch lower and—" She left the thought unfinished, her hands trembling slightly as she applied a clean bandage. Jed caught her wrist gently. "Thank you," he said softly, then turned to where his father stood by the window, watching the smoldering remains of the barn. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken words. "You saved my life out there, Pa," Jed finally said, his voice rough with emotion. Gid turned, his weathered face showing every one of his years. "Couldn't let them take my boy. Not again." He moved to the table, settling heavily into a chair. "Should have done that years ago. Stood by you instead of against you." The room grew quiet as the others tactfully moved outside, leaving father and son alone. Jed reached for his shirt, wincing at the movement. "I understand why you didn't," he said. "You wanted to protect me from this life, from becoming what I am." "And what exactly are you, son?" Gid's question carried no judgment, only genuine curiosity. Jed was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I'm what I needed to be, what others needed me to be. But maybe I was running too. From here, from you, from facing the fact that I couldn't be the son you wanted." "You're wrong," Gid's voice cracked. "You've always been exactly the son I wanted. I was just too blind to see it, too caught up in my own ideas of what a Parker should be." He reached across the table, placing his hand over his son's. "Your mother would be proud of you, Jed, just like I am." The words hit Jed harder than any bullet, breaking down walls he'd built years ago. "I should have come back sooner," he admitted, his eyes glistening. "Should have written, at least. Pride's a dangerous thing." "Runs in the family," Gid smiled sadly. "But it's not too late to fix things, if you want to." Before Jed could respond, Deputy Cooper burst through the door. "Riders coming!" he announced breathlessly. "Looks like Crows gathered every outlaw in the territory. Must be at least 30 men." Jed started to stand, but Sarah rushed back in, pushing him firmly back into his chair. "You're in no condition to fight," she insisted. "Then we'll make our stand here," Gid declared, moving to help his son up despite Sarah's protests. "Together this time." Father and son shared a look of understanding. Whatever happened next, they would face it as family. The rift between them, though not fully healed, had begun to mend, and perhaps that was worth all the pain and struggle that had brought them to this moment. The midday sun beat down mercilessly as Crow Mulligan and his army of outlaws approached the Parker farm. Jed, his shoulder throbbing beneath fresh bandages, stood on the porch beside his father. Behind them, the townspeople had transformed the farmhouse into a fortress, with Deputy Cooper and others positioned at every window. "Quite a welcome party you've arranged," Crow called out, reining his horse to a stop 50 yards from the house. His gang spread out in a menacing semicircle, their weapons glinting in the harsh sunlight. "But it won't make any difference. You're all going to die today." Jed's voice carried across the yard, steady and cold. "Last chance to ride away, Crow. Take your men and leave this town in peace." Crow's laugh was ugly. The famous phantom shot, making threats with a bum shoulder. How the mighty have fallen. His eyes narrowed. "You killed 3 of my men last night, wounded 4 others. That demands a response." "You started this when you burned my father's barn," Jed replied. "Everything that's happened since is in your head." Tom Johnson moved to stand beside the Parkers, his sledgehammer resting casually on his shoulder. Sarah Wilson emerged from the house, her rifle ready. One by one, the townspeople showed themselves, forming a line of defiance. "Well, ain't this touching?" Crow sneered. "The whole town is coming out to die together." He raised his hand, preparing to signal his men to attack, but Jed had anticipated this moment. As Crow's hand started to fall, carefully placed dynamite charges, set during the night by Tom Johnson, exploded around the perimeter of the farm. Horses reared in panic, throwing several riders. The orderly semicircle of outlaws dissolved into chaos. "Now!" Jed shouted, and the defenders opened fire. The battle erupted with devastating fury. Bullets splintered wood and shattered windows. Crow's men, though momentarily disorganized, began a coordinated assault on the house. But the townspeople held their ground, their determination making up for what they lacked in numbers. Deputy Cooper's precise shooting dropped 2 outlaws trying to flank the house. Sarah Wilson, proving her worth again, protected their left side with deadly accuracy. Tom Johnson engaged in fierce close combat when several renegades made it to the porch, his sledgehammer proving as lethal as any gun. Through it all, Jed fought through his pain, making impossible shots despite his injury. His rifle sang death to any outlaw foolish enough to expose themselves, but even he couldn't be everywhere at once. A group of renegades managed to reach the barn's remains, using the charred timbers as cover to pour heavy fire into the defenders' position. The situation was growing desperate. "We need to draw their fire," Gid shouted over the gunfire. "Give our people a chance to regroup." Jed saw what his father was planning a moment too late. Before he could stop him, Gid Parker broke cover, running toward the barn while firing his shotgun. The move worked. The renegades turned their attention to him, giving the defenders the opening they needed. But at what cost? Time seemed to slow as Gid ran toward the barn, drawing the renegades' fire. Crow Mulligan himself emerged from cover, a cruel smile spreading across his face as he raised his pistol toward the old farmer. "Got you now, old man." Jed watched in horror as his father stumbled, caught by a bullet in the leg. Gid fell hard and Crow advanced, his gun trained on the wounded man's head. The distance was impossible, over 200 yards, with Jed's injured shoulder screaming in protest as he raised his rifle. "Drop your weapons!" Crow shouted to the defenders, "or the old man dies right here!" To emphasize his point, he pressed his gun against Gid's temple. The farmyard fell silent except for the whisper of wind and the groans of wounded men. Jed's world narrowed to the sight at the end of his rifle barrel. Everything his father had taught him about shooting, everything he'd learned in his years as the phantom shot, crystallized in this moment. "You've got one chance, Crow!" Jed called out, his voice steady despite the fire in his shoulder. "Step away from my father!" Crow laughed. "You're 200 yards away with a bum shoulder. You really think you can make this shot? One twitch and your father's dead." Gid's voice carried across the yard, calm despite his situation. "Take the shot, son. I trust you." Those words, "I trust you," echoed in Jed's mind. How long had he waited to hear them? How many years had he spent trying to prove himself worthy of that trust? Time slowed even further. Jed felt the wind on his face, gauging its speed and direction. He factored in the distance, the drop of the bullet, his injury. Most of all, he felt his father's trust, solid as the ground beneath his feet. The rifle cracked once, the sound like thunder in the silent yard. Crow's gun flew from his hand, spinning through the air with impossible grace. The bullet had struck it perfectly, splitting the barrel in two without even grazing the man holding it. Even before the pieces hit the ground, Jed had chambered another round. "That was the warning shot," he said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the battlefield. "The next one won't be." Crow stood frozen, staring at his ruined weapon, then at his empty hand. The legendary shot he'd dismissed as mere story had just become devastating reality. Around him, his men lowered their weapons, the fight draining from them as they realized what they'd witnessed. "It's over, Crow," Jed continued. "On your knees, hands where I can see them. That goes for all of you." One by one, the renegades complied. Sheriff Hayes and his deputies moved in to make arrests, while Sarah Wilson and others rushed to tend to Gid's wound. The impossible shot had ended more than just a battle. It had ended the reign of the Reckless Renegades, proved the legends true, and most importantly, it had been born of a father's trust in his son. 2 weeks after the battle, the Parker farm hummed with activity. Townspeople had gathered from miles around, working together to raise a new barn. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air, mixed with laughter and conversation. Sounds of a community reborn. Jed, his shoulder healing well under Sarah Wilson's careful attention, worked alongside his father. They moved in comfortable sync now, the years of separation melting away as they fitted boards and secured beams. The new barn was larger than the old one, built with the strength of unity and the promise of a fresh start. "Never thought I'd see the day," Sheriff Hayes remarked, pausing from his own work to watch the Parkers. "The whole town is coming together like this." He wore his badge with renewed pride now, having helped bring Crow Mulligan and his gang to justice. Tom Johnson, taking a break from his metalwork, nodded in agreement. "Funny how things work out. Took the renegades trying to destroy us to make us realize how strong we could be together." The sheriff's deputies had their hands full at the jail, processing the captured outlaws. Crow Mulligan and his core group would be transported to the territorial prison next week, facing long sentences for their crimes. The others, mostly young men led astray, were being given chances to reform under the town's supervision. "You know," Deputy Cooper called down from the roof where he was laying shingles, "they're already writing songs about the Phantom Shot's return, about how one man's courage inspired a whole town to stand up for itself." Jed looked up, shaking his head with a slight smile. "It wasn't one man's courage. It was everyone here, choosing to fight back instead of giving in to fear." Sarah Wilson, bringing water to the workers, paused beside him. "Maybe," she said softly, "but sometimes people need a spark to light their own courage. You and your father provided that spark." Gid, limping slightly from his healing wound but refusing to rest, placed a hand on his son's good shoulder. "The farm's going to need both of us now," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "That is, if you're planning to stay." The workers fell quiet, aware they were witnessing a pivotal moment between father and son. Jed looked around at the half-built barn, at the familiar fields stretching to the horizon, at the faces of people who had become more than just neighbors. They had become family. "I think the Phantom Shot has rode far enough," he said finally. "Time to put down roots again. If you'll have me, Pa." Gid's eyes glistened as he pulled his son into a rough embrace. The gathered crowd broke into cheers and applause, celebrating not just the return of a prodigal son, but the rebirth of their community's spirit. As work resumed on the barn, the sound of hammers mixing with happy conversation, Jed caught Sarah's eye. She smiled warmly, and he realized that putting down roots might mean more than just reconciling with his father. The Parker farm was coming back to life, stronger than ever, built on a foundation of courage, trust, and the unbreakable bonds of family and community. The Silver Dollar Saloon buzzed with life as fiddle music filled the air. Where once the renegades had spread fear, now townspeople gathered to celebrate their victory and newfound unity. A local songwriter had composed the Ballad of the Phantom Shot, and its verses rang out across the crowded room. At a corner table, Jed and Gid Parker sat together, each nursing a glass of whiskey. The past month had transformed both men. Gid seemed younger somehow, unburdened by old regrets, while Jed had found a peace in his eyes that years of wandering had never given him. "They got the story all wrong in that song," Jed commented, listening to the verses about his legendary shot. "Makes it sound like I did it all alone." Gid chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "Let them have their legend, son. Sometimes people need stories to believe in." He paused, watching Sarah Wilson enter the saloon. "Besides, it seems to me you're writing a new story now." Sarah made her way to their table, carrying fresh drinks. She had been spending more time at the Parker farm lately, helping with the rebuilding and sharing long conversations with Jed on the new barn's porch. "The cattle buyer was here earlier," she said, settling beside them. "Says with both of you working the farm, you could triple your herd by next spring." "Assuming my son remembers how to ranch," Gid teased. "Might have forgotten while he was off being famous." "Some things you never forget, Pa," Jed replied, his smile easy and genuine. "Like home." Deputy Cooper approached their table, his badge shining in the lamplight. "Just got word from the territorial prison," he announced. "Crow Mulligan and his men arrived safely. They'll be spending a long time behind bars." The news rippled through the saloon, prompting a round of cheers and raised glasses. Tom Johnson stood, lifting his mug high. "To the Parkers!" he called out. "Father and son, who showed us all what it means to stand together." The toast echoed throughout the room, but Jed and Gid had eyes only for each other, sharing a look of deep understanding. Their journey had been long and hard, marked by pride and pain, but it had led them here, to this moment of perfect reconciliation. As the evening wound down, Jed stepped out onto the saloon's porch, Sarah by his side. The stars sparkled overhead, the same stars he'd followed on countless lonely nights. But now they seemed to shine with a different light, not guiding him away, but welcoming him home. "You know," Sarah said softly, "legends never really end. They just change into new stories." Jed smiled, taking her hand in his. Inside, he could hear his father laughing with old friends, could feel the warmth of community and belonging that had been missing from his life for so long. The Phantom Shot's tale was indeed changing, becoming something richer and deeper. A story not of lone justice, but of family, redemption, and the courage to begin again. If you thought this story was intense, you won't want to miss what happens in our next video. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to never miss an update. This is just the beginning of our journey together.